If both the body and the mind are networks of energy and information from a more abstract reality, then of course, the next question is, what is that abstract field from where energy and information are generated? And I'll come to that in a moment. But what I want to do right now is to say to you that a good understanding of this inseparability between mind and matter, not only in our own physiology, but in the physiology of nature, is really crucial for our survival, not only as a species, but for the survival of our planet. I really mean that. We have gone through a turbulent evolutionary history, and everyone who's familiar with Darwinian evolution is familiar with the expression survival of the fittest. And that phrase was probably very relevant and pertinent when we lived as hunter-gatherer tribes in forests and had to be wary of predators. But now, as I'm sure you agree, we, the human species, have become the biggest predator on our planet. And if we know the history of predators, we know that it ultimately leads to their extinction. So if we have to survive as a species on our planet, and we have to ensure the survival of our planet itself, we need a new kind of evolution, distinct from so-called Darwinian evolution. Jonas Salk, the great scientist and philosopher and humanist, has coined the expression metabiological evolution, meaning that we are over with physical evolution, but in a new phase of our evolution, the evolution of consciousness, and ultimately the evolution of consciousness of consciousness. Jonas Salk also should be given credit for coining the term survival of the wisest instead of survival of the fittest. And in order to have that new evolutionary phase unfold as a distinct reality in our own time, I think it is important to understand what is consciousness, what is mind, what is matter, and what's the connection between these three. Possibly there's no connection, they're all inseparably one. Many years ago, when I was first exploring the field of mind-body medicine, and a new whole discipline was emerging in the area of medicine, known as psychoneuroimmunology, I came across an interesting experiment performed by a scientist at the National Institutes of Health. The scientist took some mice and he gave them injections of a chemical called poly-IC. Poly-IC is a chemical that stimulates, at least in mice, the immune system. Then he took these mice and had them smell camphor, and after a while the mice would smell camphor and stimulate the immune system. Other scientists took other species of mice and gave them something called cyclophosphamide, which is a toxic chemical that destroys the immune system, and had them taste saccharin at the same time. The mice would smell saccharin and they would start destroying their immune system. Interesting situations. A group of mice smell camphor and stimulate the immune system. A group of mice taste saccharin and destroy the immune system. What's the essential difference between survival and death of these mice? Because if you expose one of them to bacteria, they'll get infections. If you feed them carcinogens, they get cancer. The others, nothing happens. What's the essential difference? It happens to be the interpretation of either the memory of the smell of camphor or the taste of saccharin. The essential difference, at least in this experimental model, seems to be the interpretation of a memory. Could this be relevant to us? It's estimated by some psychologists that the average human could possibly be thinking about 60,000 thoughts a day. This is not surprising. What is a little disconcerting is that about 95% of the thoughts you have today are the ones that you had yesterday. We literally become bundles of conditioned reflexes and nerves that are constantly being triggered by people and circumstance into predictable outcomes of behavior and also predictable biochemical reflexes. predictable events in this body. We become the victims of our own memories. The stale repetition of outworn memories. The irony, of course, is that my tormentor today is myself left over from yesterday. I think here's a very crucial understanding into the whole idea of how it may be possible to change biochemical, physiological, and experiential events. If these transformations in the body are the result of energy and information, and if energy and information is a result of interpretation and thought and feeling and emotion, then by perhaps witnessing this whole process, we may be able to influence the expressions of these states of energy and information, the biochemical expressions, the behavioral expressions, etc. You might ask, it's really true, I replace 98% of the atoms in my body, I'm making a new body once a year, then why do I still have the arthritis? Why do I still have the same blocked arteries? And the answer to it may be that through conditioning, we generate the same impulses of information and energy, which is not merely the same thoughts and feelings and emotions and ideas, but also the same behaviors, the same dietary habits, the same sensory experience of the world. And as a result of that, we of course engender the same states of information and energy that transform themselves into the same biochemical events, the same physiological events, the same behavioral patterns, and ultimately the same outcomes of disease. There's a great expression in ancient Vedic science, the science of Ayurveda, the science of life, as it comes to us from a very ancient tradition, where the expression is, I use memories, but I do not allow memories to use me. Now, that's a very interesting expression, because here you may have a key to perhaps what may constitute the healing response. I use memories, but I do not allow memories to use me. You have to use memories, obviously, otherwise you won't find your way home tonight. But when you allow memories to use you, you become a victim instead of a creator. Allowing memories to use you is to be in the state of reaction constantly, and using memories to create responses that are creative in the field of all possibilities is to become a creator. It's the essential difference between what in spiritual traditions has been called bondage and freedom. The bondage is to our own memories, and the freedom is also from our own memories. I'll get into this in detail in a few moments, but I want to lay the groundwork for this inseparability of mind and matter and how it influences the state of health. Another fascinating experiment was published in the journal Science in 1980, where scientists at Ohio State University were studying the metabolism of cholesterol in rabbits. They were feeding rabbits diets that were extremely high in cholesterol, and then looking at cholesterol elevations and atherogenesis, which is hardening of the arteries. And to their amazement, they found that there was one group of rabbits that did not get the same extent of atherosclerosis or hyperlipidemia, even though these rabbits were being fed the same diet. There was, in fact, a 60% less incidence of hyperlipidemia and its complications. And they couldn't figure out what the difference was between these rabbits, till somebody found out that the technician who was feeding these rabbits, instead of just throwing the food at them, he would take them out of their cages and he would pet them and cuddle them, whisper sweet nothings in their ear. And now, as a result of this experience of love, and if you don't like the word, if it's scary, you can call it the flow of information and energy. As a result of this new experience, these rabbits, they transferred the cholesterol into a completely different metabolic pathway, making the essential difference between life and death from the number one killer in our civilization. which is, of course, as you know, cardiovascular disease. So even though it's important what we eat, it seems like our state of awareness when we're eating influences the metabolic pathway of food. A thing that science has not yet recognized. When you look at nutrition from a purely scientific point of view, there is no place for consciousness. And yet consciousness could be one of the crucial determinants of the metabolism of food itself. Another fascinating study that I came across a few years ago was in the journal Pediatrics by scientists and investigators at the University of Miami School of Medicine. And these scientists were looking at premature infants and their ability to thrive. Infants born about 8 to 10 weeks prematurely. They divided the infants into two groups. In one group, they had little holes in the crib through which an investigator could reach in and stroke the baby about 3 times for approximately 15 minutes. They didn't, of course, call it stroking. They called it kinesthetic tactile stimulation, which is the Orwellian medical terminology for stroking. God forbid, call it love. But those babies that received this tactile kinesthetic stimulation gained an average of up to 49% more weight per day fed on exactly the same formula, leading the investigators to conclude that, quote unquote, tactile kinesthetic stimulation is a cost-effective strategy because you can save $3,000 per admission. They gain weight so much faster. We now know that if you lovingly touch someone, there is an immediate release of growth factors and growth hormones, particularly in babies and children, but even in adults. And growth hormone is an anti-aging hormone. It's a hormone that is known to have biological effects that reverse the aging process, even in adults. It's an anabolic hormone. When dogs lick their puppies, that's what happens. Growth hormone spurts occur. In fact, there's a condition that scientists recognize, endocrinologists recognize, it's called psychosocial dwarfism. And in this condition, you have children who are literally dwarfs. You measure growth hormone in their system, in their blood, it's very much depressed. And if you give them growth hormone, they still don't grow because the receptors do not bind to the growth hormone. Because these kids are not just physical dwarfs, they're emotional dwarfs. Take them out of this environment, put them with a loving mother or a mother figure, and touch them, and suddenly you'll see elevations of growth hormone, and the receptors will start to soak in this growth hormone. What we're seeing is the transformation of consciousness into a material thing, in this case, growth hormone. Growth hormone, a product of a certain code of intelligence in consciousness. Now there are many studies that show that it's not just growth factors, but many other biochemicals. There's a rush of chemicals, of healing chemicals into your system just through the experience, the sensory experience of the world. But that sensory experience has to be non-threatening. It has to be nourishing. It has to be loving. Love transforms itself into these healing chemicals. You've heard that song, I'm sure. Touch me, feel me, hear me, heal me. Happens to be a fact of physiology. A few years ago also, I came across an extraordinary study which was looking at risk factors for sudden death from cardiovascular events, cardiovascular disease happening to be the #1 killer in our civilization. And I said to myself, why are scientists looking at risk factors for cardiovascular deaths? Of course, we know what they are. Smoking and hypertension and high cholesterol. Well, recent statistics indicate that more than 50%, which is actually the majority of patients who are dying prematurely of sudden death from cardiovascular events, in fact, do not have any one of the standard risk factors. What was found? The #1 predictor of fatal coronary events was job dissatisfaction, people who hated their jobs. And there's a very interesting concept in Ayurvedic medicine. The concept, it's in fact a spiritual law, literally. It's called the law of dharma. This word dharma in Sanskrit means purpose in life. The law of dharma says we are here for a reason. And it says this reason, at least there are 3 components to it. Number 1, to discover the true nature of reality, to pierce the mask of matter and confront reality, not through the artifact of sensory experience, but as it really is. Because between us and reality, there's the screen of perception. There's such a beautiful expression from one of William Blake's poems, and let me see if I can remember it. He says, "We are led to believe a lie when we see with and not through the eye, which was born in a night to perish in a night when the soul slept in beams of light." The first component of this law of dharma is to confront reality, not through the artifact of perception, but to confront it as it really is and recognize that it's our own spiritual nature. And I'll talk about this later. The second component of the same law of dharma is to serve our fellow human beings, to ask the question, how can I help? And the third is to express our unique talents, because the law of dharma says everyone that is alive has a unique talent and a unique way of expressing it that no one else has. There's one thing you can do better than anyone else on this planet. And when you're doing it, you lose track of time. You escape time-bound awareness. So I would restate the number 1 risk factor for death, premature death, is lack of meaning or purpose in life. The number 2 predictor happened to be something called self-happiness rating, whether you think you're happy or not. As a result of this study and other studies, and similar studies in Europe, an amazing statistic has emerged. More people die in our civilization on one particular day of the week, and I'm sure you can guess which one that is. Yes, and guess what time? So 9 o'clock on Monday morning, more people die in our civilization than at any other time. It's an extraordinary and stunning and unique accomplishment for which only the human species can take credit. Because I would presume that no other animal knows the difference between Monday and Tuesday. What's the difference? It's just an idea. It's just an idea. And you can't see ideas. You can't lock them up in a test tube. You can't observe them through a microscope. But ideas have been the harbingers of disease and death and devastation and war. Maybe they could be the messengers of healing as well. Even our experience of space and time is similarly self-engendered. Ask a good physicist, has anyone ever done an experiment or given a mathematical formulation for the existence of the flow of linear time? Ask a good physicist that, and she'll tell you there's no such experiment and there's no such formula. That the flow of linear time is a phenomenon that is created by the nervous system. In a universe where past, present, and future all coexist in a field of all possibilities, that the experience of linear time is actually just nature's way of preventing us from experiencing everything all at once, which is the way it's really happening. And of course, from our own experience, we know that we have a personal experience of time. If you're having a good time, then time flows. A few years ago, I took this flight from Boston to London, met this old friend of mine. We had such a good time, time flew. They told us that the flight was 6 hours, but to us it appeared, as the English expression goes, we got there in a jiffy. Forgot to eat, forgot to sleep. When we got there, we didn't even have the experience of jet lag. All these biological cycles, fixed cycles of rest and activity, all these rhythms that orchestrate digestion and metabolism, they got restructured. As a result of the experience, we had a good time. And of course, you may know other people in your environment who constantly seem to be the embodiment of the expression, I am running out of time. They see the same clocks that you and I see, but for them, they're moving much faster. If you examine these people, you'll find they have speeded up biological clocks. They have faster heart rates and jittery platelets with high levels of adrenaline. These are scared platelets that are huddling together in their fright. High levels of all the other stress hormones. When they suddenly drop dead of a premature heart attack, then of course they've run out of time. And then we meet people whose internal dialogue seems to be, I have all the time in the world. They have a slower biological clock. And once in a while, we've all had the experience, perhaps you were in love, or perhaps you were making love, or perhaps you were looking at eternity between the clouds, gazing at the stars. Perhaps you were walking on the beach. Perhaps you were listening to some exquisite music. Perhaps you were praying. And suddenly, you slipped out of time-bound awareness altogether. As when a person says, the beauty of the mountain was breathtaking, time stood still. What's that experience when time comes to a standstill? What's that experience? Abraham Maslow, the great American psychologist, stated this is a peak experience. Ancient wisdom traditions have called this the experience of unity consciousness. Unity consciousness means that the observer and the object of observation become one. They become unified into one wholeness of experience. The seer and the scenery become one. The knower and the object of knowledge become one. The observer and the observed become one. They are the same thing in different disguises. It's also the experience of love, but love not as a mere sentiment, love as the ultimate truth at the heart of creation. A great Indian poet by the name of Rabindranath Tagore once said, the same stream of life that runs through the world and dances in rhythmic measure runs through my veins, night and day. It is the same life that shoots in joy through the dust of the earth into numerous blades of grass and tumultuous waves of flowers. It is the same life that is rocked in the ocean cradle of birth and death, in ebb and in flow, and my limbs are made glorious by the touch of this world of life, and I feel the life throb of ages dancing in my blood this moment. That's the experience of timelessness. We escape time-bound awareness in unity consciousness.
Of medicine, he was chief of staff at New England Memorial Hospital, a best-selling author of 12 books, including Ageless Body, Timeless Mind, and Quantum Healing. He's the executive director for the Institute of Mind-Body Medicine in San Diego, California.
In the last session, I think I gave you a reasonable hypothesis to understand the body, mind, and the environment as a continuum. I thought we covered enough evidence to see that that, in fact, is a good probability that the distinction that we have between the body, the mind, and the environment as separate things is really an artificial one created by the interpretation of our perceptual experiences. That, in fact, these are all part of one network of energy and information that comes into existence from a field that is a priori, that is even before this continuum of energy and information. And that it is possible for human consciousness to even experience this reality, to have the experience of what is known as unity consciousness, where the observer and the observed become one, where the seer and the scenery become one. And this has frequently been referred to in spiritual traditions as the experience of love. Love not as a mere emotion, love not as a mere sentiment, but love as the ultimate truth at the heart of creation. Love as the experience of unity consciousness. Tagore, that great Indian poet whom I quoted last time, once said, when I feel beauty, I know it as truth. And what is beauty? It is love at the heart of creation. This continuum of no separation. That even time, in fact, or the experience of time, is similarly self-engendered, because in reality, there is only eternity. Time is a perceptual experience. If you read Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, and you read the introduction to that book by Carl Sagan, there's an extraordinary statement in that introduction. It says, Stephen Hawking set out to understand the mind of God. Stephen Hawking set out to understand the mind of God. As far as I know, there's only one other scientist who was audacious enough to make a similar statement. Albert Einstein once said, "I want to know God's thoughts. The rest are details." So what kind of conclusion does he come to when he sets out to understand the mind of God? He says, we live in a universe that has no beginning in time, that has no ending in time, that has no edges in space, and nothing for a creator to do. Now please try and conceptualize that, and please try and visualize that, please try and imagine that, and you'll find it's totally and utterly and completely impossible. How can you conceptualize or visualize something that never began? Scientists use the word Big Bang to, in the first 3 minutes, to postulate that the universe had a beginning, at least in space and time. But the fact is, you can't visualize that. It's non-visualizable. And the moment you compromise and say, perhaps there was a beginning, then of course your immediate dilemma is, if there was a beginning, what was there before the beginning? If there's an ending to this universe, then your immediate dilemma is, what's there after the ending? If there are edges in space, then what's there after the outermost edge? It turns out that quantum physics is not only stranger than we think it is, it's stranger than we can think. At least the way we can think linguistically, the way we can think in this verbally elite language of ours. But of course not in the mathematical language, which seems to be the language of nature. Mathematics is the language of nature, but mathematics in its equations, of course, always takes into account 0 and infinity, which are non-conceptualizable visually or at least linguistically. So we see that even the experience of time is created in our consciousness. It's a result. Our personal experience of time is a result of our own internal dialogue. A few years ago, I was traveling in Germany, and a physician friend of mine drew my attention to a news report. It was about 7 miners that had been trapped in a mine. And they knew that they had very limited amount of time because they had limited access to oxygen. And only one of the miners had a watch. And in order to allay the anxieties of the others, every time 2 hours went by, he would call out 1 hour. At the end of the week, they were all rescued, and they were all alive, except for the fellow who was calling out the time. He had them change their subjective experience of time. But of course, he measured his own experience by looking at a watch, even though he had the rest of them change their subjective experience of time. Time is a subjective experience, and you cannot measure subjective experiences. A great English physicist, Sir Arthur Eddington, he said, trying to measure a subjective experience is like trying to figure out the square root of a sonnet. You can't do it. You cannot do it. You may find some objective correlates, and yet time, feelings, emotions, desires, these all occur in this quantum realm of consciousness. So in order to just summarize what we have covered so far, I'd like to go over a few principles. And let's see if we can look at these a little carefully. The physical world, including our bodies, is actually a response of the observer. Intrinsically, it's a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup. You and I are like magicians, like King Midas, who could never know the texture of a rose or the soft caress of a kiss because everything he touched turned into gold. Similarly, in our usual state of consciousness, our waking state of consciousness, we leave aside other realms of consciousness that seers and sages have talked about for thousands of years. There's an ancient expression, infinite worlds come and go in the vast expanse of my consciousness. They are like motes of dust dancing in a beam of light that's shining through a hole in the roof. Leaving aside that, in our ordinary, usual, waking state of consciousness, we can never know the true texture of quantum reality, because even as we turn to perceive it, we break it up into material reality, into time-bound reality. And that time-bound physical world is a response of the observer, and how the observer uses the instruments of observation, the nervous system. But in its essential state, our body, as well as the universe, is made up of energy and information, not solid matter. All our technologies are based on this presumption, that in its essential state, this is a non-material, non-physical universe. That the mind and the body are inseparably one. They are the same thing in different disguises. The mind is a field of information and energy being experienced subjectively. The body and the world is the same field of energy and information being experienced objectively. That even the biochemistry of the body is influenced by awareness. We saw that in those experiments with rabbits and tactile kinesthetic stimulation, etc. Sensory modulation, how we utilize or experience our sensors. Our sensors are transducers that take the energy of the universe. So our sensors, for example, the ears, are transducers, electronic transducers that convert mechanical energy into electrical energy in the brain. Our nose and smell receptors convert chemical energy into electrical energy ultimately in the brain. Our eyes are receptors that convert electromagnetic radiation into electrical energy in the brain. These are transducers. And this experience that we have of the flood of hormones in our system is really, or flux of chemicals in our system, is really the way we metabolize our sensory experience. If I say to somebody, you have cancer, immediately there's a rush of toxic chemicals in their body as a result of the fear that's generated. If I say to someone, I love you, there's a completely different response. But as far as the ear is concerned, all it gets is mechanical energy, vibration. A few years ago, I used to volunteer at an AIDS clinic, and they had a silly custom. On Monday mornings, they would take the blood tests of all the patients. Wednesday, they would announce them. So the doctor would sit here, and all the patients would sit in a circle, because the doctor would pick up a piece of paper, and he'd say, John? He'd look at John and say, negative. And you would see John's whole body immediately. You could see the flush of energy and life in that body. Then he'd take another piece of paper, and he'd say, George, positive. And you would see the rush of toxic chemicals in this person's body. You could see the life ebbing out of this person. You could see him actually dying before your eyes. And I asked myself, what's the difference in the vibration of the atmosphere when you say the word positive and compare it with this word negative? They're just little vibrations in the atmosphere. They tickle a few hairs in your internal auditory canal. There's a little blip of electricity. The input is identical. In fact, you could produce the identical input with those words positive and negative. And yet the output is radically different. So somewhere there's been a detour. And that detour is not in the material realm. It's in the quantum mechanical realm. It's in that field which is beyond both body and mind. And even the biochemistry of our body is a product of this awareness. That perception, even though it appears to be automatic, is a learned phenomenon. We learn how to perceive as a result of our cultural indoctrination, our social indoctrination, our evolutionary history, etc. In reality, impulses of intelligence create our body in new forms every second. Impulses of intelligence are impulses of information and energy. They are our thoughts and feelings and emotions and desires. That although each of us seems to be separate and independent, all of us are connected to patterns of intelligence that govern the whole cosmos. that there are no well-defined edges to the quantum mechanical body. We are localized bundles of information and energy in a universe of information and energy. This universe is alive with information and energy. But it's not ordinary information and energy. It's information and energy that feeds back upon itself and influences its own expression, which is evolution. Evolution is nothing other than the ability to change the expression of information and energy. So we can't call it just information and energy, it's intelligence. This is an intelligence universe, and we are conscious beings in a conscious universe. And the human nervous system is that privileged organ of nature through which the universe itself is becoming conscious of itself. The universe is becoming conscious through you and me. And that is the privilege we have as this human species. That although we seem to be separate, we aren't. We are, as the great American poet said, every atom belonging to you belongs to me. That even time does not exist as an absolute, only eternity. Time is quantified eternity, as it is quantified in consciousness. Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, once said, this lifetime of ours is like a flash of lightning in the sky. He said, this lifetime of ours is as transient as autumn clouds. To watch the birth and death of beings is like watching the movements of a dance. A lifetime rushes by like a torrent down a steep mountain. But we identify ourselves with our self-image and not with ourself. That's why we get the experience of time. That in reality, there is only eternity. That each of us inhabits a reality which is in fact beyond all change, and I'm going to come to that. I'm going to come to that very important point, because there is a component here, a component of existence that is beyond change. And that, for lack of a better word, we can call the soul or the spirit. Now, of course, if you go to a scientist and you say, you have a soul, the scientist will usually respond by saying, I'd like to believe that, show me where it is. Scientists would say that of the mind as well, because as you probably will have figured out, there's no real proof that the mind exists, no scientific proof. We have only circumstantial evidence that the mind exists. And yet, if it weren't for the invisible animating force of mind, we would all be paralyzed. I wouldn't be able to speak to you. I wouldn't be able to move here. So thoughts have an animating force, an invisible animating force without which we would be paralyzed. And yet you can't document scientifically that this thing actually exists because you cannot see it under a microscope. So the same thing holds true of a soul. What is the soul? The soul, every religious tradition, every spiritual tradition, every part of the world has called it the animating force of life. It holds the integrity of the body and mind, and when it leaves, of course, then the body disintegrates because this was the animating force. In the last century, scientists who were intrigued by the notion of soul would actually weigh a person sometimes just before they died, and then they weighed them immediately afterwards to see if something left. But since they didn't find any difference in the weight, at least they came to a reasonably good conclusion. If you have a soul, it probably doesn't weigh anything. In our own century, there was a brilliant scientist. His name was Wilder Penfield, and for 30 years, he looked at, this question. Where is the thinker of the thought? Who is the thinker of the thought? Because I'm not my thoughts. I'm the one who's having the thoughts. I'm not my emotions. I'm the one who's experiencing my emotions. I'm not this body. I'm the one who's having the experience of this body. The body is an experience. The mind is an experience. The world is the experience. But where's the experiencer? Dr. Penfield was very interested in finding the soul, in finding the experiencer. And when he would operate on his patients, he would stimulate different parts of the brain to see what was happening. Dr. Penfield would do operations under local anesthesia because the brain is that part of the body where you can, in fact, stimulate different parts of the body, of the brain, without causing any discomfort or pain. The brain doesn't have any pain receptors. And one day, Dr. Penfield was operating on a young woman, and he touched a part of the brain, and the patient was immediately transported to a previous experience. She found herself in a kitchen cooking food for dinner, and she heard herself listening to her children playing in the yard, and actually she even experienced herself worrying that they would be run over by the traffic. And Dr. Penfield asked the patient, are you really in the kitchen? And she said, no, I'm speaking to you and you're doing surgery. And Dr. Penfield said, this person is having two experiences at the same time. On the one hand, she's in the kitchen, and on the other hand, she's speaking to me. In other words, there's a silent witness behind the scenes that knows that this is the sensory experience, but this is the reality. Another time, he was operating on a young man, and he was immediately in the middle of a baseball game. He suddenly had the experience of a baseball game that he had seen 20 years ago, and even saw a little kid coming through the fence into the crowd, and at the same time he was aware that Dr. Penfield was operating on him. But he was able to make the interpretation that this was a hallucination and this was reality. And Dr. Penfield wondered to himself, where's the interpreter and who's the interpreter? Another time, Dr. Penfield was operating on a young man. He was stimulating a part of the brain known as the motor cortex. And as he was doing so, the patient's arm started going up like this, and Dr. Penfield asked the patient, what's happening? The patient said, my arm is moving up. And Dr. Penfield asked the patient, are you moving the arm? He said, no, you're moving it for me by stimulating the brain. And then actually what the patient did was he reached out with his other arm and prevented the arm from moving, even though Dr. Penfield was stimulating the brain. And Dr. Penfield wondered to himself, he said, the brain is telling the body to move, but there's somebody that's telling the brain, I won't let you do it. Who's this choice maker, and where's this choice maker? You and I are essentially interpreters and choice makers. In every moment of our existence, we're making interpretations and we're making choices. We are the thinker of the thought. We're not the thought. And if you're sitting out there and you're saying, I doubt everything that you're saying, I don't believe any of this, then that's who you are, the doubter. As long as there's a doubt, it implies the existence of a doubter, the thinker of the thought. Where is this thinker? Where's this soul? Why can't we find it in the body? Dr. Penfield said, I can't find it in the body.